Australia and many other countries such as the US are facing a housing affordability crisis. The average home price in some cities is now 10 to 15 times the average household income, and at the same time, interest rates are at the highest point in over a decade. But if buying a home is so unaffordable, why are prices going up so fast? Why are they expected to continue rising for the foreseeable future? And if you're in the market to buy a property, should you buy now or wait for conditions to improve? The housing affordability situations in Australian cities are some of the worst in the world. The average home in Melbourne just reached a new all-time high of $1 million. Yes, you heard me correctly, an average run-of-the-mill home in my city is now a 7-figure purchase. And Australia's biggest city, Sydney, is somehow so much worse, with an average home price of $1.4 million. But measuring housing affordability isn't really about the prices of houses, it's more about the cost to own a property compared to household income. So for example, if you wanted to buy that average home in Melbourne for $1 million, you'd first need to save around a $200,000 deposit for a down payment, and then take out a 30-year mortgage with an interest rate of about 6.5%, which will cost you about $1,200 per week. According to the ABS, the average household in Melbourne earns about $1,900 per week, so the average household would be spending more than half their income to own an average home in Melbourne. And as bad as that sounds, Melbourne is only 9th on the list of least affordable cities in the world. Sydney is actually number 2 on the list, with property prices reaching 13.3 times household income in late 2022. Oh, and housing affordability very clearly isn't just an Australian problem. China, the US, Canada, and New Zealand all have cities on the list as well. And it's not just expensive for homeowners. Renting a place has surged more than 40% in just 2 years. There's been plenty of discussion about the rising cost of food and energy in Australia, but it's actually rent that's been a significant driver of inflation recently. Housing affordability has been getting worse in Australia for decades, and I will talk about some of the long-term trends and drivers in this video, but first, it's important to also appreciate some of the more recent challenges. In the last 3 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a few economic ripples that have had large impacts on the property market. Primarily, these ripples came from dramatic changes in interest rates. Before the pandemic, the official cash rate, which is set by the Reserve Bank of Australia, was sitting at 1.5%. When the pandemic hit financial markets in March of 2020, the RBA lowered the rate to just 0.25%, and then lowered it again to 0.1% at the beginning of 2021. This rate, which is also known as the overnight borrowing rate, meant that banks could practically borrow money from one another for free. So these lower costs were passed on to customers through lower interest rates on mortgages. A mortgage with an interest rate of 4 to 5% before COVID was now 3 to 4%, or even as low as 2.2% if you used a 2-year fixed rate. Interest rates stayed low until the middle of 2022, when the RBA had another problem they had to deal with: inflation. Interest rates rose sharply to 4.1%, and that 2.2% mortgage from 2021 is now 6.5 to 7.5%. And there's actually a fairly simple economic model that helps to demonstrate the impact that interest rates have on the property market. And I know that when I say the words economic model, a lot of people click off the video, but I promise you it's not hard to follow, and I guarantee by the end of this video, you will know far more about how the real estate market functions than any other video you've watched on this platform. This is the DW real estate model, developed by Denise D. Pascal and William Wheaton in 1992. The model isn't able to explain everything that happens in the housing market, but it's taught in many major universities around the world, including the one that I attended, because it's a really good way of understanding the mechanics of the housing market. It might look confusing, but it's basically just 4 different graphs that have been placed together. Why they're placed together will make sense in a second. The first graph represents the rental market, and more specifically, how does the market determine how much it costs to rent a home? Well, it's mostly a function of how many houses are in stock and available for rent. If there's lots of houses in stock, you can shop around and find a cheaper deal, so rent will be cheaper. But if there's very little stock, you'll be forced to compete with other renters for what's available, so rent will be more expensive. The next graph leaves the rental market behind and focuses on the market for selling properties. And in this case, the price of houses is mostly a function of rent. The more rent a property can earn for its owner, the more valuable that property is to own, so its price will be higher. The third graph is the construction industry, and the amount of construction is mostly a function of house prices. If homes are selling for higher and higher prices, then more properties will be developed to capitalize on the opportunity. And finally, there's the inventory graph. The amount of inventory of houses is a function of construction. The more houses being built, the more inventory of houses there will be available. The cool part about this model is that each of the 4 sub-markets all influence and self-regulate each other, determining the cost of rent, the prices of properties, the amount of construction needed, and adjustments to the level of inventory. And when a shock hits one of these quadrants, we can see how it impacts the entire market. So check this out. One of the impacts that we saw recently was the sharp increase in interest rates beginning in 2022. Mortgage interest rates rose from a low of 2.2% to about 6.5% today. That means that on a $1 million property with a 20% deposit, the monthly payment went from about $3,000 per month to about $5,000 per month. The sharp increase in the cost to own a home first impacts the market for selling properties. When the cost of mortgages increases, holding all else equal, the graph's slope will steepen, which in simple terms just means that home prices get more expensive even though rent hasn't changed. For example, a property that earns $700 per week in rent that was previously worth $1.4 million is now worth $1.3 million. And actually, that's exactly what happened in Sydney between February and August of 2022. House prices dropped pretty quickly by about 8%. That impact then ripples out to the construction quadrant. Lower home prices and higher cost to build mean less new developments are started. Also, you have homeowners who just don't want to sell into a weak market. Less construction ripples into the inventory quadrant, where the number of available houses declines, constricting the supply side of the industry. And finally, less inventory of houses flows into the rental quadrant. Less availability of houses mean the price to rent a house goes up. And again, this is exactly what happened. Rent in Melbourne, for example, is up over 30% since the beginning of 2022. So the DW real estate model helps to explain how one impact in, say, one subsection of the market ultimately ripples out and impacts all 4 quadrants. But there's something wrong with this explanation, and if you've looked at this stuff before, you might have caught it. At the beginning, I said that higher mortgage rates will lead to lower property prices. And while in Sydney, home prices did fall in 2022, they then quickly resumed increasing and today are at an all-time high, even though mortgage rates are still a lot higher than just a couple of years ago. And in Melbourne, prices went down even less before again surging to an all-time high. What's missing is that the model is only good at explaining or observing one change at a time. In this case, we've been looking at the change or the impact of the change in interest rates. But there's also been other factors, 2 actually really important factors that have absolutely nothing to do with COVID that have also been impacting the Australian property market. The first is population. Australia's population has grown at an enormous rate for decades, and growth has been particularly strong in our major cities. Melbourne, for example, had a population of just 2.6 million in 1971. That number has almost doubled to 5 million as of 2021. That pace of growth is insane, and it's not slowing down. Quite the opposite, actually. The Centre of Population Projections estimates that Melbourne will experience about 1.6 to 2.1% annual growth in population until 2033, which means Melbourne is on track to have another 1 million people here within a decade. And most of this is from overseas migration. Australia has a fantastic multicultural identity, and a huge factor in the success of our economy has been lots of people wanting to come live and work here. And if you live in Australia, it's no surprise at all to you why there are people coming here in droves. it's the best place to live in the world. And it's not just me saying that. The Economist Intelligence Unit, or EIU, does an annual review of cities and ranks them based on quality of life. They assess stability, healthcare, culture, environment, education, and infrastructure, and in 2023, Melbourne and Sydney were 3rd and 4th on the list, and Melbourne was actually number 1 for 7 years straight from 2010 to 2017. All of this is to say that Australian cities are some of the most desirable cities in the entire world, so it shouldn't be surprising at all that lots of people want to live here. I guess that's the double-edged sword of being born in Australia. Obviously, it's incredibly fortunate to be born in this city, but it's also very expensive if you want to stay here. And it might seem fairly intuitive why a population increase would drive higher property prices, but again, I'll really quickly use the model to demonstrate how this works and how this affects all 4 quadrants of the market. It starts with the rental curve shifting outward, reflecting higher demand for housing. So for the current amount of inventory available, the cost of rent will rise. Higher rent drives higher property prices because the same house now earns more income for its owner. Higher prices should then drive more construction and development, eventually increasing inventory and lowering rent again, and therefore lowering house prices. But you might have noticed some of those steps haven't quite happened. In a frictionless vacuum of a property market that doesn't exist in any world, more foreign investment and migration should spur increased property development, which helps to keep prices down. Instead, in reality, we're not seeing a lot of property development, which is keeping supply extremely low and driving higher rent and property prices. And a lot of it does have to do with consequences out of the pandemic. The cost to build a house is now about 30% more expensive than it was before the pandemic. We've all experienced how inflation has impacted our groceries and some other things. Well, inflation has been driving up the price of materials and labor for construction companies. And because the increased costs came on so quickly, there's actually been a huge number of bankruptcies in the sector. According to ASIC, there's been over 1,800 construction companies that have entered administration between July 2022 and April 2023. And some of these were big companies: Porter Davis, ProBuild, and Pivotal Homes. Basically, a lot of these companies had fixed price contracts with their customers, which essentially means that they were agreeing to sell these homes that they hadn't built yet at a fixed price in the future under contract. And then when the cost of materials and labor went up, a lot of these projects that they were working on just simply became unprofitable. But then beyond the pandemic impact, there's also just a natural limitation on the construction of new homes in big cities. Demand for property tends to ripple out from the central business district of a city because that's where people come together to work. But there's obviously limited physical space around a CBD. So what do we do? Well, right in the center of the CBD, developers build up. You get apartment buildings and skyscrapers. The further you go out, the more space there is relative to demand, so you see more single and double-story homes, more backyards, and ultimately lower home prices. But as demand increases, the city faces a persistent problem. Do you allow apartment buildings to be built in what used to be a quiet suburb, allowing supply to increase, or do you prevent large development and watch housing shortages drive home prices higher? So let's answer the question that you might have come to this video for. If you're in the market to buy a property, should you buy that property now, or should you wait for prices to come down in the short term? And unfortunately, the short answer is nobody knows. But that's boring. So instead of me giving you advice, let me just paint a picture of the important data that we're seeing today. Firstly, the next few months to a year is pretty uncertain for the Australian property market because of something called the mortgage cliff. A lot of Australians who purchased homes in 2020 and 2021 were able to lock in 2 or 3 year fixed term rates at around 2.2 to 2.5%. Since then, mortgage rates have risen to about 6.5%. So between 2022 and early 2024, a lot of mortgages will be converting from a very low fixed rate to a very high variable rate. And that's really been the story, or the question mark, over the Australian property market this year. Are we going to see a huge number of people defaulting or having to sell their properties because of this dramatic increase in their mortgage payments? Well, as of this video, about half of the mortgages that are undergoing that rapid increase in their mortgage payments, about half of them have already undergone that process, and there hasn't been any overwhelmingly obvious problems. but there has been some cracks. CoreLogic reported that the number of loss-making short-term sales increased from 2.7% last year to 9.7% as of June 2023. So of the properties that have been bought and sold within 2 years, or in other words, people caught up in the mortgage cliff situation, of those people, almost 10% of them have now sold their property at a loss, which of course you wouldn't do unless you had no other choice. It's also reasonable to assume that there's probably some lag effect from the mortgage cliff, that it might take many months or even up to a year or longer before someone decides that they have no other choice but to sell the property they recently bought at a loss. So the next thing to watch out for is short-term sales, and particularly loss-making short-term sales over the next 12 to 24 months. But that's the short term. The long-term trends will potentially outweigh any long-term bumps. Long-term meaning the population growth and construction limitations we spoke about earlier. So what's the answer then? Buy now or wait? Well, unfortunately, again, the answer just, it depends. It depends on what your aim is when you're buying a property. If you're buying a home to live in forever, you have one consideration for price. If you're buying strictly an investment property, then you might have a different consideration for price. Personally, either way, if I was buying a house to live in or as an investment, I would think of it as an investment property. I'd be doing the maths that way, but that's just me. Also, across most of Melbourne, net rental yields are negative, meaning the interest expense on the loan is higher than the gross rental income it can earn. So unless you're buying a property and just banking on the idea that some greater fool will pay more for it down the road, you have to be expecting that rent is going to rise a lot. I have no idea whether rent will rise a lot or whether it'll be property prices that moderate, but recently it's been the former. The cost of rent is going up fast. So it's complicated, and I certainly don't have all of the answers, but hopefully through this video, you've got a little bit of a better understanding of how the housing market works. If you want to support what I do here on YouTube, there's a free way. You can just hit that little subscribe button. What I was going to say red subscribe button, but I actually don't know what color it is anymore. Is it still red? I don't know. Anyway, you can click the subscribe button. It's completely free, and you can leave me a nice comment. That also helps the algorithm with engagement. If you want another way to support me, a further way to support me, you can check out our private investor community. I'll leave it as the first link in the description below. You get access to a bunch of exclusive content, and you'll be supporting, directly supporting what I do here on the channel. So with that said, have a great weekend, guys. I'll see you later.